All right, so let's jump into 1066, a year when England was basically up for grabs. You had not one, not two, but three powerful guys all wanting to be king. Ambition, betrayal, and battles that just reshaped England. And right in the middle of it all is Harold Godwinson, the guy who almost became king.
You know what's so interesting about that time is that England was like a glittering prize. Unlike its neighbors, places like Wales or Scotland. Think about it, a unified kingdom, a centralized government. And you've got these rumors of wealth, spreading across the seas. It makes sense why people were looking at England.
Yeah, you really paint a picture there.
Yeah.
And yeah, it makes you realize that this guy, Harold Godwinson, he wasn't just a side note in history. He was stepping onto a stage that was already set for some serious drama.
Mhm.
So today, let's unpack his story. Started with the world he was born into.
Well, if we go back a bit, we find England dealing with the aftermath of the Vikings. Remember Canute the Great? He wasn't just some raider. He conquered England, became king, and really shook things up for the English elite. Brought in his own people, put them in power, and that's where Harold Godwinson's family really started to rise.
So Harold's family wasn't your typical Anglo-Saxon nobility. They were kind of a mix of Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures, almost like they were a symbol of England's changing identity.
Exactly. And that blend gave them an advantage. It's like they understood both the old and new ways of power. So you have Harold's father, Godwin, Earl of Wessex. He becomes powerful under Canute. Think about that. It's a serious position to have influence in a kingdom that's still figuring itself out.
And then there's the family connection, which just adds another layer to all of this. Harold's sister, Edith, she's married to King Edward the Confessor. I mean, talk about a direct link to the throne.
Oh, yeah. That marriage was a major power move. It linked the Godwinson family with the future of the monarchy. But Edward, even though he was king, had his own struggles, especially when it came to having an heir. He was a very pious man. You could even say he was consumed by it.
So we've got a king struggling with his beliefs, a powerful family with their eyes on the prize, and the shadow of the Vikings still looming over everything. This is already more complicated than any history book I've ever read.
And it's about to get even more tangled. Because Edward's devotion led him to a decision that would throw everything into chaos. He decided not to have children. Can you imagine the pressure he must have been under, caught between his faith and the need for a stable kingdom?
It's like he unknowingly set the stage for a power struggle. What did this mean for the Godwinson family? Did they see this as their chance?
Oh, they definitely saw the way things were changing. And Edward, knowing how fragile things were, he tried to manage the situation. He brought over relatives from Hungary, hoping to find a successor who wasn't connected to the Godwinsons. Can you imagine traveling from Hungary back then?
That's a journey that tells you everything about how desperate Edward was.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the Godwinsons weren't just going to sit back and watch their power slip away.
Oh, absolutely not. They were too powerful to ignore, and they blocked Edward's every attempt to secure the succession. They knew the game, and they were playing it masterfully. It's just this incredibly tense situation, You've got a king with no heir, a powerful family just waiting, and all of this is happening while the rest of Europe is watching.
Yeah, it's like everyone's holding their breath, just waiting to see what happens when Edward dies.
And then, bam, Edward the Confessor dies. It's a moment of pure opportunity. And Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in England, doesn't waste any time. He's elected and crowned king, all within a day of Edward's death.
A day. Wow, that's fast. Even for the Middle Ages. Was there a reason for that? Like a strategy?
It was definitely a power move. Think about it. A quick coronation means his rivals don't have time to react. But it also tells us something about Harold. He's decisive, ambitious, and he's willing to break with tradition to get what he wants.
And wasn't there something unusual about where he was crowned, too? Didn't he break with tradition there as well?
You're right. Harold chose Westminster Abbey, this magnificent building that was closely tied to Edward the Confessor. It was a symbolic choice, connecting himself to Edward's legacy, maybe even trying to use Edward's piety to make his own claim seem more legitimate.
So it's like he's using these symbols of power to strengthen his position. But did this hasty coronation actually cause more problems for him?
That's the big question. While Harold secured his power in England, news of his coronation spread fast. It reached two powerful figures who believed they had a better claim to the throne. William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada, the Viking King of Norway.
Okay, now things are getting really interesting. Two rivals with their own ambitions. Let's start with William of Normandy. What was his claim to the throne?
Well, William was a distant relative of Edward the Confessor, and he claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years ago. Now, whether this promise actually happened is up for debate, but William definitely used it to justify his invasion.
So to William, Harold was basically a thief. someone who stole what was rightfully his.
Exactly. And William wasn't just some angry relative, he was a strong leader who had built up a powerful army in Normandy. Plus, he had the support of the Pope, which added this whole religious authority to his claim.
It's amazing how much religion influenced politics back then. Papal support was like the ultimate endorsement.
Yeah, it was a powerful tool. Now let's talk about Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. His claim goes back to Canute the Great, the Viking king we talked about earlier. Hardrada saw himself as the rightful heir to this North Sea empire that Canute had created.
So for Hardrada, England was part of his Viking inheritance. It's so fascinating how all these different historical events and family lines, they all come together at this one moment. It's like a medieval Game of Thrones.
It really is. And for Harold, this meant war on two fronts. First, he had to deal with Hardrada's Viking invasion in the north. He gathered his forces and marched north, amazingly fast, and met Hardrada's army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge.
And this is where we see Harold's military genius, right? Wasn't this a huge win for him?
Absolutely. Stamford Bridge was a decisive victory for Harold. He completely crushed the Viking army and killed Hardrada in the process. Can you imagine that battle? The clash of swords and axes, the shouts and screams. It must have been incredibly brutal.
You can almost hear the metal clashing. This victory must have given Harold so much confidence, made him look like a true warrior king.
Oh, without a doubt. But
Yeah.
just as he's celebrating this triumph, trouble is brewing in the south. News reaches Harold that William of Normandy has landed his army in England. Talk about bad timing.
Wow, that's a twist. Harold just won this huge battle against the Vikings, and now he has to deal with a Norman invasion. It's one challenge after another. Do you think this victory against Hardrada actually hurt Harold in the long run? Did it make him overconfident, too eager to fight William?
It's hard to say for sure. We can't know what was going through Harold's mind. But after such a big win, it's possible he felt unbeatable. Or maybe he felt so much pressure to protect his kingdom that he didn't even think about his army's exhaustion.
Yeah, that makes sense. As king, his most important job was to defend his people and his land. He couldn't just let William walk all over England.
Exactly. And William wasn't just sitting around either. He was attacking English villages and towns, putting a lot of pressure on Harold to act quickly.
So Harold's army is exhausted from fighting the Vikings in the north. And now they have to march south to fight William and the Normans. It all leads to the Battle of Hastings, one of the most famous battles in history. But knowing what we know now, was Harold's decision to fight William a mistake?
Historians have been debating that for centuries. It's easy to judge in hindsight. Harold was facing a very skilled commander in William, and his own troops were tired from their previous battles, but he had also just proven himself to be a great warrior. Maybe he thought he had the momentum.
I can imagine the pressure he must have been under. The fate of the entire kingdom was on his shoulders. He couldn't appear weak or indecisive.
Absolutely. And remember, William needed this battle. He couldn't conquer England without defeating Harold. But Harold, as the defender, might have been better off choosing a different strategy, like wearing down William's forces over time.
That's an interesting point. By confronting William directly, Harold gave William exactly what he wanted. But again, the pressures of being a medieval king, the need to look strong and decisive, probably pushed Harold to make that decision. So here we are, October 14th, 1066. Two armies ready for battle at Hastings. What happens next?
Well, that's where the story takes a dramatic turn. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just about swords and shields. It was a clash of cultures, a battle that would decide the fate of England.
So we've got these two armies ready to clash at Hastings. It's like a clash of civilizations almost, right? You've got the Anglo-Saxons with their famous shield wall,
Yeah.
and then you've got the Normans with their cavalry and archers. Just seems like such a mismatch in styles.
Yeah, it really is. The Anglo-Saxons under Harold were mostly infantry. Just picture them, seasoned warriors, but exhausted from that forced march, forming this massive shield wall on top of a hill.
And facing them, William's Norman forces, a mix of infantry cavalry and archers, a much more flexible fighting force. It's like they were bringing a whole new way of war to England.
Exactly, and William used that to his advantage. He had his archers rain arrows down on the English lines, while his cavalry charged in waves, trying to break through that shield wall. Can you imagine what that must have been like for those Anglo-Saxon soldiers? Arrows raining down, heavily armored knights charging at them.
It must have been pure chaos, the ground shaking beneath them, the constant clang of metal, the screams of the wounded. It's hard to even imagine how brutal it must have been.
Oh, it was a brutal battle. Both sides fought with incredible ferocity. But as the hours went on, William's tactics started to work. That constant pressure, the relentless attacks, it all started to wear down the Anglo-Saxon defenses.
So how did it end? We know Harold loses, but what was the turning point? What led to his defeat?
Well, the exact details are a bit fuzzy, but it seems like a few things happened at once. The Norman attacks weakened the shield wall, creating gaps, and then tragedy struck. Harold himself was killed. Maybe by an arrow, maybe by a Norman knight. But his death crushed the Anglo-Saxon spirit, and their resistance crumbled.
It's amazing how such a pivotal moment in history can be so unclear. It almost adds to the drama.
Yeah, it reminds us that history is often written by the winners, in this case, the Normans.
So Harold is dead, his army is defeated. What happens next? Does William just walk into London and take the throne?
Not quite. There was still some resistance, but without a strong leader, the Anglo-Saxons couldn't stop the Normans. And on Christmas Day, 1066, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, the same place where Harold had been crowned just months earlier.
It's kind of poetic, isn't it? The same location. Two coronations marking this huge shift in power and the beginning of a new era for England.
And it wasn't just a change in leadership. The Norman conquest transformed English society. Everything from the legal system to the language itself changed under Norman rule. We can still see the impact of 1066 in England today.
So Harold Godwinson, the man who almost became king, ends up being the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. It's a tragic end to his story. It reminds us how quickly things can change, especially in the world of medieval politics. It's almost like something out of Shakespeare.
It really is. Harold's story is a tragedy. But it's also a story of ambition, resilience, and the unpredictable nature of fate. It makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently? What if Edward had lived longer? What if Harold hadn't had to fight two wars at once?
History is full of those what-ifs. But that's what makes it so fascinating. We can learn from these moments, analyze the decisions people made, and maybe even find some wisdom for our own lives.
Absolutely. Harold's story reminds us that even the most powerful people are often at the mercy of forces beyond their control. But it also shows us the importance of leadership, courage, and fighting for what you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into the story of Harold Godwinson, I'm left with this thought. We often think of 1066 as the year the Normans conquered England. But what if we saw it differently? What if we saw it as the year England became more connected to Europe? A year that set the stage for the diverse and multicultural country it is today.
That's a great point. History is rarely simple. It's full of different perspectives. And by exploring those perspectives, we can understand the past and how it shapes the present.
Well said. So the next time you hear about the Battle of Hastings or see that famous image of Harold with the arrow in his eye, remember the complex and fascinating story of Harold Godwinson, the man who almost became king, and the year that changed England forever.